Now, the rest of the story. Elston Gunn was a born soldier, or so he believed. From the time he was small, he'd had his eye on West Point, had envisioned himself a general commanding his own army, had even looked forward to dying heroically in battle. But when Elston eventually asked his father, "How do I get into West Point?" the latter answered, "You need connections." And frankly, connections were something Elston's family did not have. Still, the boy dreamed of ingenious tactics and awesome weapons and war and valor and victory, and in his spare time he organized a band. Elston's musical group played store openings and auctions and talent shows in park pavilions and on county fairgrounds. The engagements barely covered expenses, sometimes not even that. So after a while, Elston's musicians left the band, went off looking for better money, and so began a pattern. Elston would put a new band together. His musicians would become frustrated with the low pay or no pay, and they'd break up, and Elston would have to organize another band. But somewhere in that cycle of failure, everything changed. Elston and his latest group were performing in the Veterans Memorial Building downtown, where all of the big events, such as livestock shows and hockey games and circuses and revivals, took place. Elston and company were providing background music in the lobby for that particular evening's extravaganza. Professional wrestling sensation Gorgeous George, the superstar, had brought his entire troupe of exotic wrestlers with him, but it was flamboyant Gorgeous George himself who drew the crowds. Anyway, Elston's bands playing amid the throng, their music mostly drowned out by the cacophony of animated conversations, when suddenly the lobby doors burst open, and in strode Gorgeous George, followed by his colorful entourage of valets and costumed ladies strewing rose petals in his path. Elston was amazed at how much he himself was impressed. To him, the wrestler hero with the long blonde curls and the golden cape seemed like 40 men, like a roaring storm. And as he walked past the makeshift platform on which Elston's group was playing, the great and gorgeous George did something at once small yet monumental. The wrestler glanced toward the sound of the music, and he winked at Elston. He winked at Elston, and without breaking stride, he said, quote, "You're making it come alive." Clearly meaning the drama of the moment. You're making it come alive. Well, it may sound strange, but that was all the encouragement Elston would need for years to come. Elston forgot about the Army, thereafter put all of his effort into making it come alive through his music and the massive drama that he would one day create in a company we remember as the 1960s. Because once upon the mid-1950s, in the northern mining town of Hibbing, Minnesota, there lived a boy named Robert Zimmerman, who called himself Elston Gunn, who at first yearned for West Point, but fueled by a validating nod from a wrestler in a gold cape, went on to write and sing the theme songs of his generation, under another adopted name, of course. But that's a name the whole world knows, Bob Dylan. Only now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. You know, it's hard to imagine Bob Dylan, that phenomenal songwriter who, during the counterculture movement, wrote some of the greatest civil rights and anti-war songs in history, as a general in the military. Can you picture that? Robert Allen Zimmerman was born on May 24, 1941 in Duluth, Minnesota. When Bob was 6 years old, his father, Abram, contracted polio and the family moved to Hibbing, Minnesota. Now, Hibbing was the hometown of Bob's mother, Beatrice. They called her Beatty. Bob was raised in this house in Hibbing, Minnesota. In the early 1950s, when Bob was a preteen, he began listening to the Grand Ole Opry on the radio. Television was on the rise, but it hadn't taken hold yet. In 1946, only about 8,000 households had television sets in America. By 1960, about 45.7 million households had them. But Bob preferred to listen to the sounds of Hank Williams and Johnny Ray on the Grand Ole Opry. Bob said that the sound of Hank Williams' voice went through me like an electric rod. But Johnny Ray's was the first singer whose voice and style, I guess, I totally fell in love with. I loved his style, wanted to dress like him too. While in Hibbing High School, Bob formed several bands, including the Golden Chords, who performed covers of songs by the most popular artists of the time, such as Little Richard and Elvis. Now, can you picture Bob Dylan belting out Little Richard or Elvis songs? The Golden Chords performed part of Danny and the Juniors' Rock and Roll Is Here to Stay at his high school talent show. Now, I say they performed part of it because they played it so loudly that the principal turned the power off to Bob's microphone to get them off the stage. Bob was always uncomfortable with his name. In a 2004 interview, he said, "You're born, the wrong names, wrong parents. I mean, that happens. You call yourself what you want to call yourself. This is the land of the free." In 1959, Bob performed a couple of times with Bobby V's band, The Shadows. You remember Bobby V's hits including Devil or Angel, Rubber Ball, Take Good Care of My Baby, Run to Him, The Night Has 1,000 Eyes, and many other classics. Man, that's good stuff. Anyway, Bobby V said Bob was working as a busboy at a place called the Red Apple Cafe in Fargo, Minnesota. He said, "We didn't know that at the time." Well, Bobby V's brother Bill was in a record shop in Fargo, and this guy came up to him and introduced himself as Elston Gunn with 3 N's, Gunnn. Bill was blown away. Man, how good can this be? This was as good as it gets. And went over to the radio station with him, and there was this piano in the studio, and auditioned him on the piano. He came back and said he played pretty good in the key of C. Now, Bobby V said, "We didn't realize at the time, but that's all he could play in, the key of C." Bobby V said, "We went to pick him up for the show, and he didn't have a piano. We took him to the gig anyway, and there was a piano there. It was terribly out of tune. He sat and he played that, and when he got lost, he would come up and do background parts and do Gene Vincent hand claps. It was a trip." Bobby V sadly admitted that it was ill-fated. I mean, it wasn't going to work. Bobby V said, "A couple of years later, I was in New York in Greenwich Village. I was walking down the street. There was a record store there, and there was an album in the front window, and it said Bob Dylan. And I thought to myself, that looks a lot like Elston Gunn." By using an alias, Robert Zimmerman could transform himself into any character of his own design. He was free from the expectations people had of Robert Zimmerman. He could do, say, play, or sing anything with a sort of anonymity. Once he tired of the character, he just changed the name and became a completely new character. Bob said in an interview, "The Elston Gunn name thing was only temporary. What I was going to do as soon as I left home was just call myself Robert Allen, first and middle name. As far as I was concerned, that was who I was. That's what my parents named me. It sounded like the name of a Scottish king, and I liked it. There was little of my identity that wasn't in it." In September 1959, soon after the gigs with Bobby V, Bob enrolled at the University of Minnesota, and he began performing at a local coffee house called the 10 O'Clock Scholar. His interest in rock and roll began to fade. Bob said later, "The thing about rock and roll is that, for me anyway, it wasn't enough. There were great catchphrases and driving pulse rhythms, but the songs weren't serious or didn't reflect life in a realistic way. I knew that when I got into folk music, it was more of a serious type of thing. The songs are filled with more despair, more sadness, more triumph, more faith in the supernatural, much deeper feelings." It was during this time at the University of Minnesota that Bob created another character and began performing under the name Bob Dylan. As you well know, that name stuck. Bob said, "The first time I was asked my name in the Twin Cities, I instinctively and automatically, without thinking, simply said, Bob Dylan. Now, I had to get used to people calling me Bob. Now, originally, Bob was thinking of performing under the name Robert Allen, A-L-L-E-N. To make it sound more exotic, he was going to change the spelling of Allen to A-L-L-Y-N. Bob said, Dillon and Allen sounded similar. Robert Dillon, Robert Allen. I couldn't decide. The letter D came on stronger. But Robert Dillon didn't look or sound as good as Robert Allen. People had always called me either Robert or Bobby. But Bobby Dillon sounded too skittish to me. And besides, there was already a Bobby Darin, a Bobby V, a Bobby Rydell, a Bobby Neely, and a lot of other Bobbies. Originally, Bob was going to spell Dillon D-I-L-L-O-N. Bob agreed that he had seen some poems by Dylan Thomas and thought that changing the spelling to D-Y-L-A-N would make it more exotic and more inscrutable. I didn't change my name in honor of Dylan Thomas, that's just a story, he said in an interview in 1966, before brutally adding, I've done more for Dylan Thomas than he's ever done for me. You know, Bob is in his 6th decade as a recording artist, and there's no sign of him slowing down. His first album, entitled Bob Dylan, the one that Bobby V saw in that picture window, was released in 1962. He released his most recent album, Shadow Kingdom, in 2023. He's recorded 40 albums so far. During my research for this episode, I learned that in 2009, Bob released a Christmas album called Christmas in the Heart. Now, I love Christmas albums. You heard me right, a Bob Dylan Christmas album. Did you know this? Bob produced the album himself under another name, Jack Frost. I'm telling you, I'm not making this stuff up. The album opened at number 1 on the Billboard Holiday Album Chart, number 5 on the Folk Album Chart, number 10 on the Rock Album Chart, and number 23 on the overall album charts. Bob recorded this in the true spirit of Christmas because all royalties from the sale of this album go to charities Feeding America in the USA, Crisis in the UK, and the World Food Program. So I would be sure that I was thorough in my research. I bought a copy of the album and gave it a listen. But rather than me telling you about it, I'll share a link to the whole album, Bob Dylan, Christmas in the Heart, in the description below. Now this is from Bob Dylan's own YouTube channel. You need to take a listen to this for yourself. You can thank me later. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.